two guest speakers tonight. I'll start by introducing first Charlie Shercliffe, who lives in Ipswich. Charlie's a landscape painter and landscape architect. For years, he worked on the restoration of the Olmsted and Elliott reservations and parkways in and around Boston. In the 1990s, he redesigned the Mascanoma parking and sitting area here in Manchester. Over the past 30 years, he has worked at painting and teaching painting. His work is exhibited throughout New England, locally at the Rockport Art Association and the North Shore Art Association for Gloucester. Our second speaker, actually who's going to go first, is Tom Halstead, who was born in Cambridge and grew up in Dedham and Manchester. Following 7 years in the U.S. Army, he worked in Washington, D.C. as an intelligence, foreign policy, and arms control expert, both in and out of the government, managing several nonprofit organizations and serving for 4 years as public affairs director for a government agency. In the 1980s, Tom moved to Manchester, where he managed family property at Shark's Mouth, wrote magazine and newspaper columns, and served as a selectman for 2 terms. Since the late 1990s, he has lived in Gloucester, where he has served on the boards of the Gloucester Adventure and the Cape Ann Forum, and is currently an associate and docent at the Cape Ann Museum. He claims to be working on several books, a memoir of his life, home war, and a biography of an ancestor who fought in the War of 1812. Tom is also working on a collection of cartoons that he has created over the decades while cruising the coasts of Maine, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. He has now come ashore here in Manchester. He's in good voice, and we can't wait to hear him talk about his grandfather, Charles Hopkinson.
Said we have 2 grandsons of Charles Hopkinson here tonight. Charlie and I were born 10 years apart, so we each had a, but early enough. It's on. It's not on.
Maybe it needs to be turned on at the mic.
But no, I think the mic is on. It's on, but not. At any rate, we both he lived long enough, so we both knew him for quite a while. Charlie was 20, I think, and I was almost 30 when he died, so we got to see quite a lot of Charles Hopkinson as a unique and wonderful man. I was going to give you a little biographical sketch and spend as much time as possible looking at some of the work he did. Charles Hopkinson was born in 1869. John Prentice Hopkinson was a school teacher in Boston, and Mary Hopkinson, I believe, was also a Bostonian. His father, John, grew up in a farm in Maine, walked to Boston, walked to Cambridge, and marched into the office of the president of Harvard and said, "I want to go to Harvard." And this was unusual, but apparently they accepted him, and he made it through Harvard, and his family lived in Cambridge thereafter. John Hopkinson ran a boys' school in Boston called Hoppy's School, Hopkinson School. It was a preparatory school for Harvard. And John and Mary had 3 daughters and a son, Charles. See if this thing is working. Oh, we got a problem. Another problem. There we go. Right, there we are. Charles grew up a handsome young man who apparently was a terrible student. I think today you might have said he had some sort of attention deficit disorder. It's not clear. He admits that he didn't learn a thing in school except how to draw. And he drew, his first recollection is drawing a man with some cows. He later, in a memoir that he wrote for his grandchildren, said that the only record of my ever noticing any abstract or formal rendering of nature was my finding that a diagram like this suggested a barking dog. So that's one of his, that is not his earliest drawing, but it's his recollection of one of his earliest drawings. But when he was, by the time he was 18, he was painting quite dramatic pictures of a ship in distress in a storm. You can see the crew up on the rigging, flag flying upside down, an emergency. He also did landscapes. This is only an 18-year-old boy who is doing this work. at about this time, he had finished schooling at the Hopkinson School, and he was accepted to Harvard, although he was no better student in Harvard than he'd been before, but he did draw. And if this will work, and he drew for the Lampoon. And he became eventually the editor of the Lampoon, or if I may be mistaken, and someone can correct me if it's called the editor or the president, but he was the head man for at least 1 year. And he drew very much in the manner of Charles Dana Gibson was a big role model for him, or so he said. He also drew animals, and I've seldom seen another animal done by him after that, but they seem to know what a horse looked like. And his cartoon says, "Please keep your horses off the trees and sidewalks. We suppose things looked this way before the sign was put up." Even after the ice was broken, there still remained a slight coolness between them. So he had a certain amount sense of humor. And this seemed to be the way he got through Harvard, but somehow he managed to graduate in 1891. And in 1892, he persuaded his parents to let him go to the Art Students League in New York, where he is, age 21, just enrolled in the Art Students League. And there at the Art Students League, he met another student, and he wrote, "When I was studying at the Art Students League in New York at age 21, one of my fellow pupils was Angelica Rathbone, a tall, red-haired girl looking a good deal like a painting of a woman by Botticelli." And this is working very well. He and Angelica hit it off, but not quite the way he'd expected. After a couple of years at the Art Students League, he discovered, and she discovered, that each of them wanted to go to Paris to study art. But in 1892, this would be 1892, I think it was, 1893, young women did not go to Europe alone. They had to be married. So she said, "Charles, let's get married so I can go to Paris and study at the Atelier Julien with you. But you understand, this is just for the convenience of my being able to go. We won't consummate the marriage, okay?" And what he said is not recorded, but he clearly was frustrated by this situation. Angelica was indeed quite a dramatic woman, red-haired, not looking quite like this, but the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens is said to have used her as the model for the Winged Victory in the Sherman Monument on Fifth Avenue, New York. It's still there now. You can go down and look at it. The gold is peeling off a bit, but she's looking pretty dishy. St. Gaudens also had several lady friends, and some of them were also rumored to have been the model, so it's not entirely clear that it was Angelica. Anyway, they got to Paris, and they started out very well in this school. It was run by, at the time, a French painter, romantic painter named Bouguereau. And Hopkinson did not paint the romantic nudes that Bouguereau was famous for painting, but he did study, apparently, do figure studies. He did paint nudes. He wrote about it. We've never seen a single nude he's done, but that was then. And he and Angelica lived in a little house. They had one of the models from the school seemed to be living with them. Charles grew a beard and drank red wine. These were things that neither Charlie or I remembered anything of him doing. He might have had a glass of sherry from time to time, but he was not a bohemian, as he certainly was apparently in Paris. But the marriage, which took place in 1893, I believe, lasted about 1 year because, well, there was that condition that she'd put on the marriage. And he wrote his friend Charlie Putnam, Charles Russell Lowell Putnam, who had gone to Harvard with him. And Charlie was a doctor, studying in Leipzig at the time. And he wrote him in Germany. He said, "Can you come to Paris and talk sense into Angelica?" Well, Charlie came to Paris, and the rest is history. Charlie and Angelica left Paris together, and that was the end of the Hopkinson first marriage. Hopkinson was none of us knew about this. Of course, none of us were alive then, but neither we nor our parents nor anybody else knew this story for many, many years. He was really terribly embarrassed about how this had all come out. Various versions of the story of how the marriage ended are in family lore. Nobody knows quite what it was like, but the Putnam family lore was recorded in a biography of Angelica's son, Patrick, who was an African explorer, among other things. And in there it was made fairly clear, A, that the consummation deal was her idea, and B, that the marriage had never amounted to anything, no matter what Charles Hopkinson hoped it would be. At any rate, Charlie Putnam and Angelica were married in 1899 after a divorce. Hopkinson, meanwhile, had gone off from Paris to Brittany, where he spent more than a year staying with a cabinet maker and his family in the little town of Roscoff. He learned Breton. He painted the local fishermen there and their families and the shipping and the fishing boats and so forth. And it was probably the best thing could have happened to him. He'd failed in his marriage. I'm sure he felt it was all his fault. And this was a way to rediscover that he had amounted to something after all. I don't have pictures of the Belleck family that he stayed with, that he painted, but they were among the first of his really good portraits that he did. But I couldn't put 100 pictures on this slide projector, but we got close. But he did, before their marriage broke up, he did paint Angelica. And you remember that he said she looked like this, and this is the way he painted her. Slightly more clothed. This is a life-size standing portrait with a monkey. She had monkeys in her life, all her life. She was always having a pet monkey, and according to the book about her that was written about her son. This picture is extremely dark. It looks like she's wearing a strange blocky coat. She's actually standing in front of a wingback chair, I believe. But still, it's all very dark, but very dramatic, and it's quite a moving sight. Well, Charles came back to Cambridge to move back in with his family. This is a painting he actually did in Paris, self-portrait at about the same time, the handsome man. And he stayed at home in Cambridge and began to study art seriously there. And there's another self-portrait. You can see he's taking on a new style now. Charlie is going to talk about his style much more intelligently than I ever could, so I'll skip that, just to say that there are many self-portraits of him. But one of his first commissions, this is not it, but this is the subject of it, was a little boy that lived around the corner named E.E. Cummings. He painted E.E. Cummings at age 1.5, and again at age about 4.5 or 5, which is this portrait here. And he painted children a lot. He liked to paint the children. He did children very well. But this is one of his first commissioned portraits that we know about. One of his next commissioned portraits was the daughter of a man living on Beacon Hill named Greeley Curtis. And the daughter's name was Eleanor. And here she is at age 21. And it's a toss-up whose eyes are more beady, hers or the dog Tika's. But she looks like she has her eye on the artist, and the artist obviously had his eye on her. Eleanor Curtis married Charles Hopkinson in 1903, and her mother, her father had died by then, incidentally, but her mother, whoops, we got a little problem here. Her mother built this house for them in Manchester. If you go there today, it looks very like that, but there's no reason it shouldn't, because I just took that picture the other day. But in fact, it looked like that in 1903 also. A wing had been added on since then. So the house has changed very little. The view has changed very little. It's got a spectacular view from this house. Those of you who've done the tour that we ran back last spring and will run again this Saturday will see the scenery like this. It's up on a bluff. It's about 80 feet above the water. It looks to the west towards Singing Beach, which is just behind the wisteria. You can't see it from there. And out to the south is Great Egg Rock, and to the east you can see Kettle Island. and the great sweep of the of Massachusetts Bay, and on a clear night you can see the lights blinking at Minus Ledge and so forth. It's a very spectacular setting. And there he lived winter and summer until the 1920s, when they began, well, actually a little before that, when their daughters began going to school in Cambridge and Boston, and it wasn't practical to commute, so they would spend the winters in Boston or Cambridge at friends' houses. But Manchester, the house at Shark's Mouth, which was the Curtis family estate, was where they stayed as much of the time as they could. And they began to have children. And here is Charles, and here is Eleanor, and here is their daughter Mary and their daughter Harriet down here, and various cousins and so forth whom I can't begin to identify and won't try. This is part of a much larger gang, so we'll skip on beyond that. Anyway, they began raising children, and he began painting his children. These are three of his daughters on Dana Beach, or Graves Beach as we know it. This is his daughter Harriet and his wife Eleanor in the doorway to one of the two piazzas off of the house. This is from the living room at the Hopkinson house with the ocean beyond. This is the daughter Harriet again. And you can see he had a great time painting children. He was good at painting children. He was good at painting women. And you see also that one of the family traits are these pink rosy cheeks, which neither Charlie or I have anymore, but we did when we were little. You'll see some pictures of us later on. More of the daughters. This is my mother, Isabella, Mary, and Harriet. This is Isabella again. And this is his first of many Harvard commissioned portraits he did. He was a member of the Tavern Club in Boston for 62 years. And one of their founding members was a doctor named Frank Watson. He was a urologist. Excuse me, another sip of water here. And a professor at Harvard Medical School. This portrait was actually a standing figure. He cut it down to just the head and shoulders. And it made a big hit. It not only made a hit with Watson, but it made a hit with others at Harvard who began wanting portraits of themselves too. He painted excuse me, I'm skipping around a little bit. Another milestone in his career was in 1913, the famous Armory show in New York took place, and he was invited to show there. He had, I believe, eventually wound up having 2 paintings there. He initially had 6, and he'd taken some out, but this was one of them. This is 3 of the daughters. This was widely admired in the famous Armory show of 1913. Very different from the one that hit all the headlines, which was I was going to say Dubuffet, but who is it? Nude descending a staircase. Duchamp. That was the one that all the press got upset about because it was too radical. But this is certainly not radical, but it was a beloved painting, and it got a lot of favorable notice and put him on the map a little bit more. He then got commissioned, along with 5 other artists in 1919, to go to Paris and paint paint some of the delegates to the Paris, the Treaty of the Versailles Conference. And because he wasn't a big shot, he didn't get to Lord George or Clemenceau, so he could get his subjects to come and sit with him. The other artists complained they never could get around to painting them. So this is a Romanian prime minister, and this is the Serbian prime minister, and this is Japanese foreign minister. These paintings were all extremely well admired by the media, and again gave him a little bit more of a heads up start on his reputation. He went on. He painted Harvard professors galore, and I'm just going to skip through these. We can go back if anyone wants to. Some of them are. This is Dean Roscoe Pound. Some of them are very dramatic. I particularly like this one, fingering a page in a book and leaning forward towards the painter. And this, of course, everybody recognized him. This is Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was by then in his 80s. Painting him, he said, was quite an experience because he had him for quite a long time, but Holmes didn't have a lot of stamina, so every now and then they'd take a break, and he said that Holmes would sit back with his secretary, male secretary, who would read aloud to him from Confessions of a Chorus Girl. And then he'd come back to pose for the painting again. He actually did 2 portraits of Holmes. One is in the Harvard Law School. Are they both in the Harvard Law School? I'm not sure. You know, Charlie? At any rate, they're both in Cambridge. Something's gone funny with this, but I think we are not missing any. This is, of course, President Calvin Coolidge. He also did President Hoover. He had some amusing anecdotes about painting Coolidge, too. He said Coolidge wrote him and said, because this is going to be hanging in the White House, I want you to use the very best materials. And Hopkinson assured him he would. He got to Northampton, where Coolidge and his wife were spending the summer, and he carried his luggage and his easel and his whatever he had under his arm up to the Coolidge, and Coolidge welcomed him. He said, "Had your supper?" "We've had." And I've never been told whether he was given a meal or not after that, but that's the story everyone remembers. Anyway, he enjoyed painting Coolidge. He said to Coolidge, and he spoke to he carried on conversations with all his subjects to try and bring out their character, which was, just painting a wooden subject, you might as well be taking a photograph. But he loved to talk to his subjects and get a feel for what kind of people they were. Holmes would reminisce about Civil War battles. He asked Coolidge what it felt like when suddenly President Harding died and he suddenly found he was President of the United States, and Coolidge said, "Thought I could swing it." And that was about the end of his conversation with Calvin Coolidge. He painted his family when the children were grown, or nearly grown. This is all that Mr. and Mrs. Hopkinson and their 5 daughters in the living room in Manchester, just down the road. And this painting's now in the Museum of Fine Arts, although it seldom is on display. The family is very unhappy about that, but every now and then it is on display. And he painted more of the family. This painting, many of you who've been to the Cape Ann Museum will recognize from the atrium there. This is done on the front lawn of the house in Manchester. That's his daughters, Harriet, Mary, and Eleanor. And Charlie will explain later there was a plan to have a 4th one in there, but that never transpired due to Hopkinson's insistence that this was the right composition as far as he was concerned. This is children growing up again. This is the daughter Mary. And then he paints the next generation. This is the daughter Isabella and 2 of her 4 children. I don't have that sailor suit anymore. This is 3 of Mary's children. Some of you may play tennis with Mary Clark on the left. Alice and Marjorie is no longer living. And this is the 2 Shercliffe boys. And on the left is Charlie, his brother Arthur. Those of us who know them well will say this is a wonderful likeness of both of them. They're all good likenesses. He was very good at that. And this, I'm sorry to say, is yours truly. Which brings us to the subject of sailing, which was one of his great loves. And this was taken in Maine, but he always kept a small boat, 15, 17-footer, whatever it was, at Kettle Cove in Manchester. And when he wasn't painting watercolors, he'd be out sailing just for an hour or 2. He tried to teach his children and grandchildren to do it, to enjoy sailing. Some of them did, some of them didn't. He was sort of a Bligh, which was nothing like him when ashore, but when he was at sea, there was only one way to do things right. There he is at the tiller in his favorite little boat, the Little Nell. So what to say? I'd like to talk a little bit more about, I'd written some things down, but I don't think I need to really speak from this text that much, except to say as far as sailing was concerned, he taught me and anyone else who could stand his instruction that there was only one proper way to make fast a halyard, tie up a dinghy or shoot a mooring, or rescue a man overboard in the guise of a life preserver repeatedly thrown over the side. And what was he like? he was a gentleman as well as a gentleman, and his Victorian upbringing certainly showed through. He was not tolerant of what he called vulgarity, which covered quite a broad spectrum. Could be anything from a girly magazine to a comic book to an underwear ad in Life magazine, which he banned from the house. And as he was slipping into senility towards the end of his life, suddenly all the swear words he'd been bottling up all those years came pouring out, much to the dismay of his daughters, who had to put up with it. He was about a little under 6 feet in height, with a graceful athletic bearing and a spring in his step. Strong facial fixtures. You can't see it here, but he had a large head, I always remembered, and quite large ears. I remember he had quite thick, square-ended fingers, and they were always holding a pencil or a paintbrush. He'd have a little stubby pencil in his pocket, couldn't have been much longer than your thumb. He'd have an eraser in his other pocket. And if he didn't have a sketch pad at hand, he'd find a menu or a napkin or something else, because he was going to illustrate a point and he had to have something to write on it with. And I'd like to read a couple of things written about him, mostly from memorials written by members of his various clubs he had in Boston and other associations. His friend and protege Gardner Cox, a prominent Boston painter of the next generation, wrote about him in an obituary. He had all the virtues of a good Bostonian: originality, humor, talent, courage, gaiety, and the supreme virtue of being unlike anyone else, even his fellow Bostonians. And it should be added a lifelong, unfaltering capacity for self-discipline, which reinforced a thrust of purpose starting in his youth and swelling into a tide as ineluctable as it was quiet. He was that unusual combination, Puritan Yankee and artist to his fingertips. To watch him at work was a treat. He wrote that, and this is me talking now, he wrote that he looked upon the painting of a portrait as an adventure in getting to know his subject and bring out the characteristics he wanted to emphasize. When he worked on a landscape or a still life, he was constantly experimenting with new ways of looking at the subject with color, with emphasis. He might surround flowers in a vase with their complementary colors. He would wear different colored sunglasses to explore their effect on his painting. I recall once, actually Joy recalls once, her father visiting from Philadelphia and trying to go out and paint with Hopkinson. And they were sitting on the shore path down near the ocean, and her father suddenly realized that Hopkinson had fallen over on his left side. And he thought, what am I going to do? I mean, it looks like he's gone. And just then he heard this voice, and it was Hopkinson saying, "George, have you ever noticed that the color of the sea is very different when you're looking at an angle like this?" He would have us lean over and look between our legs at the moon to realize that it hadn't grown larger as it appeared when you looked at it normally. But let's listen to him describe his approach to painting. A portrait painter, he wrote, as much as a landscape painter, should be a maker of pictures. No portrait which is not interesting aesthetically has stood the test of time. It should please, interest, and move the observer by its design, as a piece of music does. It should have a pattern of shapes and areas and lines, of gestures and masses and contrasts of light and dark, of harmonies and contrasts of color. It should have not a facsimile of the person represented, but a description of him or her made with intense emotion. And he wrote, "There's an excitement in portrait painting. The thing has to be done with all the tension that one uses in a violent game." As Cox said, this is a classic description of the act. And he said, "There's a brave side to an artist's life. He's always pursuing the impossible. He never can paint as well as he wants to. He thinks not of himself while working, but works at his topmost ability to achieve what he knows he cannot achieve. I contend that takes courage when he somewhere nearly succeeds in his effort. How much satisfaction has he, and how long does it last? Not too much, and not a long time, for there is that image of what the work of art should have been, always shining ahead of him. But he is made happy and moved to an ecstasy of feeling akin to a religious experience by something in the visible world. And on his first love, watercolor landscapes, of which he would paint sometimes 2 or 3 in a single setting. And by the way, he would be working at his studio in Boston all day long. He had a studio in Back Bay. He'd get on the train, come home, be met at the station, come back to the house, and then, was he through for the day? No, he would paint 2 or 3 watercolors before supper time, or maybe one afterwards, in the summertime. And he wrote to Gardner. Well, he also painted. I skipped over this. Painted the ships and the sea, of course, and yacht races. He would doodle on the back of a menu or a napkin when he thought he had to make a point. For example, he was telling his viewer, "This is the difference in the rig between a fishing schooner in 1880 and 1900," and of course, we all can see the difference instantly. This is a little French fishing boat heading back towards France, I think, with a square topsail on it. There's lots of those doodles around in his notebooks, and they're all beautiful. He gave me a couple of books when I was 10 or 12 years old on shipping, profiles of merchant ships and naval vessels and so forth. And there's hardly a page in it that doesn't have one of his drawings in it explaining something a little better than the artist had done in the book. And they're wonderful keepsakes, and they're probably treasures I should better take good care of. But in any case, he was always doodling, drawing things like that. Well, he wrote to Gardner Cox about his landscape painting, and I love this description. He says, Today I've been painting madly. The blue ocean has been coming in great rollers and smashing in white on these golden rocks. Between them and my window is a wild tangle of orange and purple, with here and there a brilliant emerald little pine tree, and all in bright sunshine. And he painted the sea, and he painted the rocks, and he painted this scene to the west of the lawn here. This is looking towards Singing Beach. This is Dana Beach here, Singing Beach beyond Eagle Head. This point right here, there was a bathhouse on the other side of it, and it was always called Bathhouse Point. He painted the setting sun over Bathhouse Point, God knows how many times. But that was a scene he kept trying and trying and trying to get right or to get differently. It was, as you can see, there's vast differences between them, but sometimes they are almost abstractions. But he would sit out there into very old age on the lawn. This might be a hot summer day, but he'd be wearing an overcoat and, of course, a necktie. He wouldn't think of going out without his necktie. And he would have his painting, his tablet of paper. He'd have his a hot water bottle with water in it if he was going somewhere away from the house to carry his water with him, a little sponge, and his paints, of course. And he'd paint 2 or 3 of these before supper. And one day, when he was maybe 91, I think, he died at 93. When he was 91 or 2, he was still with it. He was still painting. He was still looking like that. And he'd been working on that same scene of Bathhouse Point. Let's say it was this one, trying and trying and trying to get it just the way he'd like it. And finally he put down his brush and he turned to me and he said, Tom, I think I'm beginning to get it. So thank you. I'd like to introduce, I guess Charlie's been introduced, so Charlie, you can tell about how he got it. Thank you. Go ahead. You're on, Charlie.
Okay, show me a painting. Okay, we haven't seen this one. This is, if that's my mother, it's about 1917. And you can see already he's interested in light. He's very interested in the composition. It's based on books he'd been reading by the mathematician Hambridge. He had no knowledge of math, but Hambridge had positioning of axes and other things, so that it all that based on the Fibonacci series and proportions, and this is built around that. He and George Bellows were perhaps the 2 top people at that period. working on composition based on the mathematics. But it pleased him, I think, and he could feel he was not doing something arbitrary, but the people were in the right place. To us, it looks very posed, but there is this great sense of lightness, and that is his family, all 5 daughters. Okay, next. Who's clicking?
I'm clicking.
And that you've seen, that's looking out the door. There's now a big piano that blocks some of the view. This is being very early, 1907. It's still more of a tonal painting. You're in golds and browns. Yet when you, in the end, when you saw those sunsets at his old age, at that point, I think he would be called definitely a colorist, and that's how if he had one word on his gravestone, it would be colorist. Okay, next. This is not the painting in the Cape Ann Museum that you all know. It's a little different. This was a study for it, and if you've been to the Cape Ann Museum, there's a nice thing on the side that describes what's going on. It talks about how his friend John Singer Sargent came down and looked at this study and said one of the girls should be curtsying, and as Tom said, Sargent said, and there should be a 4th person. And this is a contra dance, and this is a ladies' chain, and indeed you do need a 4th person to do a contra dance. It would be on this side here. But the point of this painting is it's a smaller version, pretty quick. And this figure here, can you see the ghost hover up there? It started out here, and he did take Sargent's advice, and he made her curtsying. If he did not, you would have these 2 figures about the same height, and even though positioned according to the Hambridge doctrine, it didn't make a good composition. One needed to be higher than the other. So that little ghost of painting in the background is a slight indication of Sargent's visit. Next. Typical, just painting people as he saw them on the lawn, but atypical in that he turned it into a Greek legend. This is the Judgment of Paris, where he awards apple to the most beautiful of them all. Oddly enough, that's not his daughters, but just people he asked to pose, because I think he had painted the backdrop already. That's himself and his dog he put in there. But he was always painting those trees and the water beyond and trying to get the sparkle of the water and the light on the trees. If you think I'm missing the major point, Tom, just feel free to say something too. Okay.
Let's say only that harking back to what I mentioned earlier, if you look through the great catalog of famous artists that had painted the Judgment of Paris, all but one painted that all the women they knew. But Hopkinson, maybe his prudery, or it may be that he had colorful clothing. But the other ones would do nudes, he did not.
Next. Yeah, this one, sorry to say that just sold. These are from catalogs, often the Vos catalog. This painting shows obviously both his feel for the sailing and for the light and movement. And I remember it being entered into a major show in the Boston Public Garden when they had art shows there in 1950, and it won first prize. It was always a favorite painting of everyone that came into my mother's house, and they saw it in the entry hall. All right, next. This is sort of typical of his 1950s paintings, and with this great color and simplicity, and always caring about light and shade. And this is in New Zealand because his wife had died at that point, and he would visit various daughters in turn, and this daughter was in New Zealand for 5 years, and which made a wonderful place to visit. And though he was in his 80s, he flew and loved the flying, stopped at Tahiti, went on. But you can see in the trees, he's trying to catch the wind as well. All right, next. I love this one, again, for the color. If you remember the early paintings that Tom showed you, they were sort of black and white, or if there was a color, it was a chunk of red or something, but it didn't express his feel for color and the relation to colors, and that is nothing but color and gesture. It's a path going somewhere along the estate in Manchester. Next. This is just the opposite. That must be about 60 years earlier. We think it's a turn of the century, maybe in Paris, maybe Harvard commencement that also had those tents, but again, he's very interested in the composition, but is playing it safe with color, just sticking to sort of pastel-y colors, and but it still has quite an attractive feel to it. Very small painting.
This was inscribed to Eleanor Curtis, so it was a gift to his.
Was it?
To his bride-to-be, right.
Okay, we're getting another one, though, that was a gift to her. Okay.
Oh, I know which one you mean. Right.
Yeah. Next. This is, he painted a lot looking through the piazza. We all know that the columns are dead white, and to him, having a foreground against the background gave you a good chance to really see how does this relate to that, and how does it relate to that in both color and brightness. And he would often get us grandchildren to think about that, and told us how to judge the brightness by really squinting at the scene. So the brights are bright, the darks are black, and everything else might be in between. But as Tom said, you'd also look upside down and realize that the post here, say, might not be white as you know it. You really regain your innocent eye when you're suddenly seeing it inverted, and you see the color, the true wavelength of color that's there, and not your assumption of what it is. But anyway, that was a favorite exercise of his, to paint through paint from his piazza. Of course, he was under the shade of the piazza or indoors at the same time, and could get a little out of the sun, but it did make a good composition. And again, that's right from his house, the garden wall. His wife had figured out how to design the garden, and that's Shark's Mouth. The whole property is named Shark's Mouth for this formation, and it appears in lots of his paintings. When you're up beneath it, you realize it's an overhanging ledge that looks like the huge mouth of a shark, and that was the name given to it even back in the 1700s by the farmers. So it's the traditional name, but his wife's family that bought the whole property, Colonel Curtis and the wealthy wife, the wife's parents, they kept the name Shark's Mouth for the whole property. Again, that's his style, pure color. And he was very good at putting figures into a painting, which gave you the focal point and scale and interest. Next. Yeah, that's presumably Noshan. That's the label of the painting, but he just loved the sumac, which occurred everywhere on his own property. He'd just go out and paint it. And as you notice, he keeps it very simple. Most people in a historical society care about the detail, though, so I'm not sure this is the right audience. You want the rigging and the fine detail, but that's everything that Bouguereau had that he was trying to get away from, or rather, the rest of his life he tried to get away from, and he finally did, or really for most of his life he did. Next. That's the windmill pond on the backside of Shark's Mouth, but a far more detailed study than usual, and that got acclaim somewhere. I think it was the Athenaeum in a show. That's the way Tom and I remember this place, and we thought it was forever, and the waves of the no-name storm completely broke this whole cliff down. It's all rubble today. No water, no. But there will be as the ocean rises. Yeah, another one on the back side of Shark's Mouth, again with that great concern for color. This is my mother's favorite painting, I think partly because it's her older sister Ellie and another older sister going up the secret chasm way to get to the top of Shark's Mouth. But I always like it because of the brilliant color combinations, and it's an abstract painting. If you showed it upside down, it would still be a good painting. Next. And Tom mentioned his great passion in his older life for complementary colors. So you may not see it there, but these yellow lilies have a blue outline around them. The point being to enhance the yellow, and it works. And also a stippling of red and green, and he loved to play of complementaries. So color really became more and more his thing. Next. Likewise, that's and he was interested in the passages of color. If he really was interested in Shark's Mouth, he would have made this outline of Shark's Mouth really clear, maybe by outlining it or maybe by making this lighter or darker, but he purposely keeps the values the same so it can blend together, so that it's not about things but about color, so using nature just as the vehicle for his color. But he does catch that sparkle on the water using both blacks and whites and the waves, and you get a feel for what he's painting because he's done it this way. Okay, next. More sumac. That's one of my favorite. Yeah, that's right from the front lawn looking at the ocean beyond. And if anyone has questions, we're probably 2/3 of the way through with these, Tom? Yeah, I don't, yeah.
What's the medium? Are they
Almost all these ones were color, watercolor, yeah.
These are really very modern.
Oh, that's it, yeah. He was way ahead of his time.
Could have been done last year.
Yeah, and even in the newspapers of 1920, the Bostonians who liked him would say, it would be a show in New York, and they'd say, even John, he's out-Marined even John Marin. He was way ahead of his time, and I think he may be remembered more for his watercolors than for his portraits. Yeah.
What age was he?
What?
What age?
Was this one be? Could be. I'd guess this would be 70s and 80s, but he also did very colorful, loose watercolors even in the 1920s.
You told me his age was 70 or 80.
Yeah, but they're not. But then, if you think about it, John Singer Sargent was doing watercolors very wild and loose at about that same period. They did meet occasionally and liked each other, and so there were other painters doing something comparable at that time as well. Next. This watercolor shows the sweep of the shore, pretty much from Shark's Mouth around to Bathhouse Point and beyond. And he loved the fall. This is huckleberry season, but again, he would have the. This is low tide with those rocks, which I've tried to paint. Seaweed is the absolute hardest color to paint, but that Irish marsh zone, there's red, you swear there's red, you know there's brown, and somehow there's blue where it's wet, reflecting sky, so he loved trying to catch that. Next. And as Tom said, the way Tom and I remember him is he'd be out in the lawn, he'd come back from the Fenway studio to relax, he'd set up the paints and start painting the setting sun, looking right into the setting sun. He never had cataracts, his eyes remained good to the end, and I think he caught it. I think that's terrific. He'd wet the paper with a handkerchief, and not too wet, not too dry. He'd and somehow knew how to do it. So you see that the paint would merge where he wanted it to merge and bleed where he wanted to bleed, yet be crisp in places where he wanted it crisp. So there must be quite a lot of that. A lot of them are reminiscent of the paintings of Arthur Dove, who was painting in about 1905, 1910, at the time that the Boston School was doing all these precious fastidious paintings, and same time as St. Gaudens, who you showed in the Sherman Monument, and his Cornish crowd were doing angels, but Dove and my grandfather were doing, really thinking about in a more modern way. Yeah. I don't know. That looks to me like a small one. I guess it's a quarter sheet of watercolor paper, 10 inches by 15 inches. Most of them, though, were half sheets, 15 by 21. Okay, next. Yeah, and these last two I noticed weren't even signed. I forgot to say, they usually signed it with CH, and in between the C and the H is a sailboat. That was his way of doing the S, turning the S into a sailboat. Once he was walking outside a gallery in New York, and he'd seen his CH had been turned into a WH, and the painting was being sold as a Winslow Homer watercolor. But he didn't mind. This is, again, near Shark's Mouth with the water just surging in, as Tom said. And that was in a magazine in about 1930, I think. That's, is that an oil, Tom? I can't. Yeah. Do you own it? Yeah. That's a, so he could do it in oil too. I think, and that's Dana Island, looking quite different, but it is Dana Island, I think. And that is I learning how to paint. Next. Yeah, that's the one of the between his house and his mother-in-law's house. There are 5 houses on the property. The 10 daughters of the other house, including his wife, wanted this garden, and they built the garden, established the fountain in about 1901, and he had met her at that point, and this was his painting of this garden area. And somewhere here it says, to Miss, is that right? To Miss Eleanor Curtis, Charles Hopkinson. I can't quite read the date. 102, say, but I think she was still Miss Curtis at that point. But there's a photograph of him painting it, and everyone loved him at that point, so it's obvious he would marry her at that point. Next. And it is important, as Tom said, to remember this was their only house. The parents were very wealthy. They were less wealthy. They stayed in this one house, usually through the winter, until even the daughters would take the train to Boston and trolley car out to Windsor School and then back again. But for 5 daughters, that got awfully wearing. And they would, as Tom said, move in by January, maybe for 3 months to Boston, and that would put him very close to the Fenway studio, so it was better all around. But he loved painting in the snow in Manchester, and there are photographs of him painting way out on the shore in the middle of the snow. But again, that's painting the snow, but this time with the presence of winter and the different colors you get, for example, on the island and the water at that time. Okay, next. Yeah, that's in the Cape Ann Museum. Good. And this is 1910. It's, yeah, right. Yeah, we call her Aunt Hat, though it's really Tom's and my mother's Aunt Hat. It's a very loose painting. He doesn't just draw the book is just sketched in briefly, which in 1910 is very daring. Everyone else at that period would draw every single little detail, but he was now starting to move into color, and he wanted to emphasize the important things, the color, and de-emphasize the unimportant things. And it's the play of light. For example, she's sitting in the shade, but the reflection is of him and his wife in the sun, and his wife in the sunlight. The dress is less bright than that in the shade, yet you know it's the other way around. So he's caught the reflection dampening out the brightness, and that's why he called the painting thank you, Claude Lorraine glass, because the Claude Lorraine glass, which is either a smoke mirror or a reflective mirror, both reduce the values in a very complicated scene. Again, the same way he taught us to squint to get the values, so you could see by squinting, you would know to paint one of them lighter and one of them darker. But that's the kind of thing he loved playing around with, and if he got it right, the viewer would unconsciously know it was right. Next. That's the one that got into the Armory show that Tom mentioned. Again, very careful about the composition and axes and the diagonals. He always loved the diagonals. This one was painted in about 1912. The show was in 1913. But there's another painting, identical size, identical composition. He's traced over this one. But the other one has remarkable colors in it, and it looks like Matisse did it, and I think he did it immediately after the Armory show when he'd seen what Matisse and others had done, and said, you know, this is pretty tame. It's just really not that much different from the Boston school that I've been rebelling from. And if I was Matisse, I'd do it this way. So I think this was the period he really was learning to get to loosen up and really find his color and looser game. That's Tom's mother on the floor. Next. And that's various of our mothers and sisters, I guess, swimming on the property. There's no decent beach in the property, so you stumble over rocks. But in this date, they had a metal rail that you could at least hang on to get out to a swimmable rock. And again, Dana Island in the background. That painting is at the Cape Ann Museum, and my mother offered the museum a watercolor and showed him everything. Harold Bell picked this one. I think he made a good choice. Very, very simple and yet good. Next. He was very good with figures, I think you'll agree, and they make all the difference there. Do you think those are daughters, Tom? Yeah, I think so. If so, that makes it into the 1920s. Next. And that's how we remember him painting. This is, though, as before we were born. This is his wife playing chess with his Maylie, who's the second oldest. And there is Charles Hopkinson painting his second youngest daughter. And you see her in her bare feet. And they don't count because his painting seems to stop about here. That's the easel. And he's in his white pants. He always dressed, as you noted, with a tie, but also in his elegant clothes, and never got them covered with paint. And it was just remarkable. But he could have painted this up in the studio. He had a studio on the third floor. Anyone who's been to the house or will go to the house will see that studio. But he much preferred painting in the ground floor because here he could be with his wife playing chess and the daughters and everything else in the house. And he also liked the background of he painted a lot of people in this position. He loved the vertical, positioning the vertical arch and the vase of flowers and a few other things, and the way the light came in at that door. So he loved painting in the living room, and that's how we remember him. Next. And he's taken a lot of liberties here, and is that in the Cape Ann Museum? I think it is, yeah. And that was, I think they picked that again because it was more forward-thinking than some of the others, and presumably could be Gloucester. But this looks to me like it was done out of his head, and that's unusual. So he was not there he was not challenged by the colors in front of him, so it's a somewhat different kind of painting. Next, and that's more the typical painting, all about light. Okay, next. That's it.
Thank you. This is
Good. Thank you.